This portion of your talk show is sponsored by Mercy Health, a passion for making lives better. Your community, your opinions, your forum. This is your talk show on News Radio 1230 WCLO. The opinions expressed by your talk show host do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the station or Bliss Communications. The open line phone number is 752-4000. Please remember that all calls will be live on the air. Now, here's the host of your talk show, Tim Bremmel.
All right, welcome back to the program. One of the other topics that always gets the phones to ring when we have open phone time, if I bring it up, is driving under the influence of alcohol, and that's usually triggered by some story that shows a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th offense, drunk driver out there, and people think it's ridiculous, and how can that happen? And we go round and round and round. One of the proposals that's out there to try and make a dent in this problem is the proposal to make the drunk driving laws stricter in the state of Wisconsin. And there's a proposal out there that Republican Representative Jim Ott and Senator Alberta Darling have been working on for a number of years. And with the new governor, apparently time to take another crack at this. So joining us on the phone, State Representative Jim Ott. And Jim, I need to clarify something as we begin this, because I'm looking at a article written by the Associated Press that actually appears in today's Janesville Gazette and has been in a couple of other publications. And it makes reference to your proposed legislation in the idea that the proposal being a first offense is a misdemeanor, and I thought it already was.
Not in Wisconsin, Tim. And by the way, good morning. Good to be with you today.
So it is not even a misdemeanor currently in the state.
No, it's considered a civil forfeiture.
Wow. Okay. So it's just like a traffic ticket.
It's like a traffic ticket, but it would be like a really, really bad traffic ticket, because by the time you add up all the expenses and inconvenience and lost work time, whatever else is involved, hiring an attorney, insurance increases, paying the fines and court costs, you might be spending upwards of maybe $2,000 having to deal with an ignition interlock on your automobile if you're above 0.15 blood alcohol concentration. But nevertheless, it is basically a civil forfeiture. It is not a criminal penalty. So and Wisconsin is the only state that it is not a criminal penalty.
Your and Senator Darling's proposal is not to make it a felony right off the bat, then it is to actually make it a misdemeanor?
That is correct. And no one that I know of has ever suggested making first offense a felony. In Wisconsin, the 4th offense is a felony. The first offense is a civil forfeiture. The 2nd and 3rd are criminal misdemeanors, and then it becomes a felony upon 4th offense and above.
So really, if people want to term this something, these first couple of offenses, certainly the first one, but even 2 and 3 are sort of slap on the wrist. You outlined that people may want to consider exactly what that term means, but as opposed to there being a felony on your permanent record forever, all those kinds of things that come with a felony at offense now number 4.
Right, and of course the distinguishing feature between a misdemeanor and a felony. A misdemeanor is a crime for which your incarceration time would be less than a year and would generally be served in a jail setting, and a felony would be of incarceration of a year or more and would be served in a state prison. So the
question that comes up most often when we get into this discussion here, Representative, is we see all these 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th offenses. Why do we make the assumption that if we change what we call the first offense as far as its criminality, that is going to be an effective deterrent?
Well, first of all, anyone who's a repeat offender at some point was a first offender. And one of the ways you stop from becoming a repeat offender is to never become a first offender. And the idea that, knowing that if you are convicted of first offense OWI, you would have a criminal misdemeanor on your record. That's a pretty serious thing to consider. And for example, right now, anyone who gets that second, third, they have that criminal misdemeanor on their record, for the rest of their lives. In Senator Darling's proposal, what we would do is say first offense would be a criminal misdemeanor, but if you don't reoffend for 5 years, it would revert to a civil forfeiture. So someone who does, say, make a mistake and then doesn't repeat that mistake would have a second chance to not have a criminal misdemeanor on the record. Nevertheless, there would be, right now you can say we give people a second chance because the first offense is a civil forfeiture, second offense is a criminal misdemeanor. This would put more responsibility on the driver to be responsible and use that. You have to wait to get that second chance. So in other words, don't reoffend in the first place, don't offend in the first place, and you won't have to worry about a second chance or criminal misdemeanor or anything. Just don't drive drunk.
Well, it's interesting because that seems to line it up with other Wisconsin traffic laws, maybe different in its characterization. But the idea that, if you have an at-fault accident, we have that point system in place, and the idea is to make you a better and more careful driver so that you can regain your points at some time. And I don't know that we've measured the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of that, but at least that makes sense to people. They understand that concept. So here again, the idea that, okay, you're first offender, this is a bad deal, but by behaving yourself, basically, you can sort of turn that around over time. That seems to be a reward for good behavior instead of just only a penalty for bad.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense, Tim. Absolutely.
So there's something to be said for that. The last time it was up in front of the House of Representatives or the Assembly. Sorry, the wrong governmental body here, in front of the Assembly. It passed in the Assembly, and the Senate did nothing with it, apparently.
Well, here's my recollection. I don't think we ever passed anything in the Assembly to make first offense criminal. I know I have introduced legislation in the past. At one point, it was to make first offense a criminal misdemeanor for blood alcohol concentrations of 0.15 and above. Right now, the law says 0.08 and above, you're impaired. This would have been, if you were almost twice the legal limit to be impaired, it would have been a criminal misdemeanor. That bill, I don't believe ever made it to the Assembly floor. What they may be referencing is we have another bill that twice was passed in the Assembly, which would have required first-time offenders to physically appear in court. Since first offense is not a criminal offense, people who are arrested and have a court date, they don't have to actually show up in court. Right. They can send in their fine or they can send their attorney. This bill would have said you got to actually go to court and stand in front of the judge, hopefully that making enough of an impression that someone would say, I don't want to ever do this again, as compared to just sending in the money. That bill actually passed the Assembly twice, and my recollection is it passed on a voice vote, was not even controversial, and that's the bill that the Senate didn't take up.
And just for refreshment of our recollection here, was the Assembly at that point in the hands of the Republicans or the Democrats?
It was in the hands, I believe it was in the hands of the Republicans at that time. And this, I'll tell you what, Tim, this is truly a bipartisan.
No, it shouldn't be.
A bipartisan issue. And, I know Governor Evers has come out and said he's open to criminalizing first offense. The bills that we got to Governor Walker's desk on drunk driving, and we have had a couple of important bills passed in the last few sessions, he signed them also. So I would have hoped that if we could have got this bill to his desk, he would have signed it. I hope if we can get it to Governor Evers' desk, he will sign it. And certainly I'm glad to hear him say that as compared to saying he wasn't open to the idea. So my challenge and Senator Darling's challenge is to get our bills, and there's a number of them we have out there, passed by the legislature. That's the first hurdle. Then they go to the governor's desk, and hopefully he'll be on board with whatever we can get to his desk.
Jim, there's a lot of controversy surrounding these kinds of things, partly because we're just a state with a culture that's, I guess, steeped in beer, for lack of any other beverage. The antithesis to this sort of is, well, you're adding more penalty. We'll get more lawyers involved early on, but we got all these penalties now, and we got all these repeat offenders, and this culture of us always being ranked the drunkest state in the union and all those kinds of things is what's going to have to change in order for any legislation that passes in regards to drunk driving being effective. How do you weigh those two things?
Well, I would say, first of all, Tim, drunk driving has decreased in Wisconsin. We have less offenses, we have less crashes than we had if you go back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And certainly you can ask, well, why is that? Well, I think at least in part you'd have to say our laws are tougher now than they were 30 years ago. So it's hard to evaluate how much is the decrease due to more awareness and how much is due to tougher penalties. We can debate that all day. One thing I will say that since I've been working on this for the last 10 years or so, certainly introducing legislation and talking about it and sometimes even passing a bill, it increases awareness. And that awareness should be for anyone that it's dangerous to drive drunk, for yourself, for other people. If you do get caught and you do get convicted, it's going to be expensive. And again, if it's second or above, you're going to have a criminal penalty on your record. I think that some of that certainly has to explain the decrease in drunk driving. The problem is, you see the news reports. There's too much of it going on. The wrong way drivers on the freeway. There was just a crash, I think, someplace west of Madison a little over a week ago, where someone was driving the wrong way on the interstate. You hear about people changing tires and getting hit by drunk drivers, police officers who are stopping a car for something else getting hit by drunk drivers, people on bicycles, people just driving through an intersection getting broadsided by a drunk driver. There's too much of it, and if you look at the statistics and say the most recent number we have is from the Department of Transportation was that there were 190 fatalities where drunk driving was a factor. In some cases it was a drunk driver themselves. In some cases it was an innocent, other person. 190 a year is, think about that. If we had 190 people in Wisconsin be killed by tornadoes, we'd be calling for better radars and, better constructed buildings and so on. We're talking about people going out on the street in their automobile, crossing the street on a bicycle, maybe being wiped out. For what? Because someone got behind the wheel impaired.
Well, it's a huge problem as long as I can remember, and kudos to you for taking this up and trying to make some changes. Are there any other changes that you as a state representative could support that have been talked about in other areas? Increasing the alcohol tax, changing hours of operation or how sales happens, or this current review of wedding barns and that kind of thing. I mean, it all kind of flutters around the same idea that there's just way too much alcohol and way too many people driving after they consume it.
Well, we have taken up a number of measures as a state and as communities that go beyond just making tougher penalties. We have safe ride programs. Many of the bars are involved in that. We encourage designated drivers. Again, awareness so very, very important. And we've got more private transportation systems available like Uber and Lyft that weren't there 10 years ago. That if somebody in a pinch doesn't want to take a chance driving drunk, they do have a chance to find another way home. So there are other things out there. As far as increasing the alcohol tax, that's one that's brought up from time to time. The thing is, if you go to the liquor store and buy a 12-pack of beer, and you take it home and you have a couple of beers with dinner, it's like, why are you being taxed because of somebody else's bad behavior? And one of the arguments for increasing the alcohol tax is that, well, it hasn't been increased in a long time. That's one of the poorest excuses for increasing a tax. So I'm not quite sure how that would work out. And nobody is trying to stop people from enjoying a good mixed drink or a beer in Wisconsin. All we're saying is, if you do that, and if you do it beyond a certain point when you get impaired, don't get behind the wheel. It's not that drinking is not against the law, and neither is driving against the law. You put the two together, and drinking to excess we're talking about,
sure.
0.08 or above, it's a dangerous situation. That's what we're trying to stop.
We always seem to be on the behind side when it comes to the state legislature getting legislation passed to deal with social ills. They always come up and we're kind of reactive to that kind of thing. Let me ask you, in sort of terms of the same context, Representative Ott, what, if anything, is being talked about as it relates to what seems like only a matter of time before the state of Wisconsin legalizes the use of marijuana and the impairment possibilities there? Is there anything that has been talked about as you continue to try and advance this legislation with alcohol?
Well, obviously, detecting various kinds of drugs in a person's system isn't, and many times not as easy as detecting alcohol concentrations. Nevertheless, what we're talking about is impairment, and there's other ways of judging impairment. Personally, I'm not in favor of the recreational use of marijuana, of legalizing it. I mean, it is smoking, and certainly it's not something you want to encourage young people to do. And certainly, taking any kind of drug, whether it's in combination with alcohol or alone to excess, the point is, if somebody's on the road and they can't keep that car running in a straight line at a decent speed and seeing when obstacles appear in the road or coming up to a stoplight and they can't stop because they don't see it or they're not paying attention, it's a dangerous situation in any case. So we're looking at impairment. Whatever causes the impairment is something that you don't want people out there who can't drive in a straight line and pay attention and stay awake.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that statement, Jim. And I wonder now, when you say impairment, we talk about that in the context of alcohol, certainly, but we also talk about it in the context of marijuana or other drugs. You could be on prescriptions where you're not supposed to drive and you're driving.
Right.
Then we have the whole smartphone, smart car scenario where there are just a myriad of distractions. Is there any thought to really approaching this? We interviewed a gentleman not too long ago here who had a device, basically a cell phone app, that would measure one's impairment. Is there a way that we can deal with impaired driving in a more general context than just drunk driving?
Well, that's some interesting points you bring up there, Tim. As far as the self-driving cars, and you mentioned earlier about the legislation trying to keep up with changes in society. Yeah, we've really had a task in the last several sessions of the legislature dealing with trying to keeping the law caught up with technology. And one of the bills that I was the lead author on a couple of sessions ago specifically made upskirting, or where someone uses a cell phone to take a picture under someone's clothes or up their dress, we had to specifically pass a law to make that illegal because, it wasn't too long ago, not everyone was walking around with a camera in their pocket. Now they are. And so who would have ever thought of putting something in the law that it was illegal to go and take a picture under somebody's clothes? Nobody ever even thought of something like that. Now we got all these cell phones, small cameras that take very high-quality pictures. So we had to pass a law to make that specifically illegal, because what prosecutors were having to do as this first developed was go under the invasion of privacy or something like that and tangentially get at the problem. The same thing is on the horizon with self-driving cars, and I'm working on legislation that would specifically make it against the law for someone to deliberately interfere with a self-driving car. I mean, can you imagine some guy who's playing around with electronics and says, hey, maybe I can do something to that car that's driving by itself? So we are always struggling to keep the law caught up with technology and with other changes in society. And as far as people with drugs in their system, whether it's prescription drugs and doing that in combination with alcohol, we just have to look at the amount of impairment. And again, that's if there's a better way of doing it than the police officer stopping someone who's swerving down the street and it turns out that it was some kind of drug combination, we'll have to keep looking for that.